Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Soyez les bienvenus chez nous, à l'Institut Macdonald-Laurier, où nous nous penchons aujourd'hui sur les relations que le Canada peut et doit entretenir avec le Taïwan. Merci d'être des nôtres. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I would like to welcome you to our special panel event on the theme of embracing Taiwan. Thank you very much for coming. As you might know, MLI has been a leader in advancing the notion that Canada should modernize our approach to Taiwan to keep up with the changing times. Taiwan is a close friend, an important trading partner, and even more importantly than those two things, a vibrant democracy in a dangerous region. In fact, if I could take a moment and recount a personal anecdote, I was honored last year to be invited to Taiwan to address the country's annual Yushan Forum. And in his introductory remarks to the forum, the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation chairman, the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation is the organizer of the Yushan Forum. The chairman of the Yushan Forum organizing group, Michael Xiao, said something quite intriguing and inspiring, I thought, in his opening remarks. Taiwan, he said, Taiwan is not a question. Taiwan, he said, is an answer. Now, I agree, but the problem is that Michael Xiao did not tell us to what question Taiwan is the answer. Let me tell you what I think the question is to which Taiwan is the answer. The question to which Taiwan is the answer is there proof that the Chinese people are not condemned by history, ethnicity, genetics, or any other factor to live without freedom, without security and safety of the person, without democracy, and without the rule of law? That is the question. And Taiwan answers, we are the proof. We are the proof that this is no mere dream. The society where Chinese people enjoy these values and institutions is a reality, here and now on an island across the Taiwan Straits from China. Because Taiwan is the answer to this question, if it did not exist in the geostrategic, geopolitical atmosphere of the 21st century, we would have to invent it. We would have to invent it. Fortunately, it does exist. And we all have, in my view, an immense responsibility to ensure that it continues not only to exist, but to thrive. Yet despite this responsibility, Canada has tended to let China dictate how we will manage our relationship with Taipei, despite the fact that in our recognition of China back in the 1970s, we did no more than to, and I quote from the documents that we exchanged with the Chinese, we did no more than to take note of China's views on a one-China policy. We did not commit ourselves to that policy. We took note that that was China's policy. In contrast to our rather obsequious policy, other countries have done far more to build their relationship with Taiwan, yet have managed to do so without compromising their relations with China. A good example is the United States. Despite having a similar one-China policy to Canada's, Washington has consistently supported Taiwan with significant arms sales, visits by high-level military and government officials, and growing military and intelligence cooperation. Underpinning this U.S.-Taiwan relationship is the Taiwan Relations Act, which requires the U.S. to protect Taiwan's independence, provide arms, and maintain high-level but officially informal relations. This act was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1979. I'm therefore not being theoretical or impractical when I say that Canada has more options than we realize when it comes to our relationship with Taiwan. On the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, today, isn't it time for Canada to look at how others manage their relations with Taiwan and stop being intimidated by China? To help answer this question, we are pleased that a number of prominent experts have been able to join us today to offer their thoughts at this panel event, which we are hosting, I'm delighted to say, in partnership with the Chair of Taiwan Studies, Scott Simon from the University of Ottawa, who will be taking the platform in a minute. It's our first joint event, and we're delighted to host Scott here and welcome him and his colleagues. Scott joins me in co-hosting this event and will also be, as I say, a panelist and chair. Before I introduce Scott, however, I'm pleased to say that Taiwan's official representative to Canada, and in keeping with the theme of our event today, I am going to call him Ambassador. Right? Ambassador Winston Wen-Yi Chen has kindly consented to say a few words. Representative or Ambassador Chen is the 10th ambassador in Canada since the establishment of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Canada in 1992. He was the Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Toronto from 2011 to 2013, and the Ambassador of the Embassy of the Republic of China in the Republic of the Marshall Islands from 2014 to 2016. He also served in the Department of North American Affairs and the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs on multiple occasions over the past 3 decades. Ambassador Chen knows Canada well and is a great friend of Canada's. Please join me in welcoming him to the platform. Ambassador.
Thank you, Dr. Corley. Dear friends, distinguished guests, well, listen to what our gracious host, Dr. Corley, just mentioned, and the inspiring story about Taiwan. Once again, I firmly believe we are on the right side of the history. Professor Simon, Secretary of State Kyoga, Keynote Speaker, Mr. Michael Coy, my friends, Mr. Jonathan Miller, ambassadors, distinguished guests, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Let me begin by thanking the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for organizing the panel discussion today. It's great to see so many friends here to commemorate with us the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relation Act. At this moment, many events, activity, and seminars has been organized both in the United States and in Taiwan this year for this purpose. And we are glad in this historical moment we have our own event in Ottawa too. Look down the road. We are living in a very critical moment in human history. If you are not saying we are facing the clear and the present danger. And the rising authoritarian regime have cast a shadow over global freedom in recent years. Taiwan is at the front lines of a battle being fought by United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, and other like-minded society in defense of freedom, democracy, and the rule-based international orders. Taiwan stands ready to share its responsibility of tackling common challenge and then to serve as a reliable and an irrepressible partner in advancing free, open, and a resilient Indo-Pacific region. We are ready, and I hope Canada is also ready. Like the theme of this event today, embracing Taiwan, Canada has more options than you realize. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
So you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Chen, for those kind remarks. It's now my pleasure to introduce Scott Simon, to whom I'm going to hand over the podium. Scott is a professor in the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies. He's co-holder of the chair in Taiwan Studies and researcher at the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. He is intimidatingly proficient in both Mandarin and Japanese. He has conducted research on various social and political issues in China, Taiwan, and Japan. He's the author of 3 books about Taiwan. We're delighted, as I said, to be holding this event in partnership with Scott, and I'm going to say ni hao and exhaust my entire Mandarin vocabulary. Scott, please come to the podium.
Kwei, bonjour. I'm going to start by thanking the Algonquin people for having prepared this territory for us. I thank you, Brian, for the good introduction. I've spent about 8 years of my life in Taiwan, and in fact, 2 weeks from now, I'll be in Taiwan on SEDEC territory in the very center of Taiwan. I think that looking at taking seriously indigenous claims puts international relations in a very new light, including relations with Taiwan. But today I'm going to take a look in my introductory remarks mostly about Canada-Taiwan relations. As I reflected on this, I was looking back at some of the old documents, and I see that Honorable Paul Martin Sr., when he was Secretary of State for External Affairs, spoke in 1966 on Canada and the Pacific at the Banff Conference of World Affairs. He said, "We consider that the isolation of Communist China from a large part of normal international relations is dangerous. We are prepared to accept the reality of the victory in mainland China in 1949. We consider, however, that the effective political independence of Taiwan is a political reality too." In 1969, the Cabinet of Canada gave instructions to their negotiators, quote, "to avoid any commitment that would deny Canada the possibility of recognizing Taiwan as an independent state at some time in the future if circumstances should make that feasible," unquote, while stating that Canada intends to maintain de facto relations with Taiwan. This is the Canadian context in which negotiators from both sides drafted the text of the 1970 joint communique. And as Brian just quite clearly explained, we took note of China's claim to Taiwan. The following day, Chief Negotiator and Secretary of State for External Affairs Mitchell Sharp explained to a concerned parliament that Canada will neither challenge nor endorse China's position on Taiwan. As we move forward to 2019, I think this context is still going on and explains the statement of Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland on April 9th in the Senate that we continue to have strong and growing people-to-people ties with Taiwan within Canada's One China policy. We are absolutely committed to expanding those ties based on our shared values. And she supported Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly. Now, as we look back to 1969 and 1970 when the negotiations were made, we can see that the negotiators had in mind 3 facts. 1, the PRC claimed Taiwan but had not yet acquired it. This is why the PRC asked Canada to recognize their claim to Taiwan, but did not feel obliged to ask us to recognize their claim to Shandong. So the fact that they asked for that means that Taiwan was not part of China. 2, the ROC, which was still a member of the UN Security Council, claimed to be the government of all of China and firmly insisted on being recognized as such, even though the PRC had ruled the mainland for 20 years. This was an increasingly untenable political fiction. Thirdly, there were 13.5 million Taiwanese who had never been consulted about whether or not they wanted to be part of either state that claimed to be the sole legitimate representative of China. Negotiators still remember that the ROC had been imposed upon Taiwan by the Allies in 1945. In 1950, and I'm sure the Chinese negotiators had this very much in mind, the Americans, under U.S. President Truman, sent the 7th Fleet to Taiwan after the outbreak of the Korean War and put Taiwan under American protection. The Chinese negotiators surely knew that Canada had participated in that war and probably saw us as part of an enemy force that had been there in Korea. Canadian negotiators were surely more sensitive to the fact that Taiwan was under martial law, which limited Taiwanese rights to expression and self-determination. Canadian negotiators also knew that Taiwanese in exile, including in Canada, supported independence from the ROC. These are the circumstances in which ambiguous wording in the joint communique allowed Canada and China to establish diplomatic relations by temporarily papering over a critical point of difference while avoiding commitment. China's one China policy is that Taiwan is part of China. Canada's one China policy meant that Canada would have diplomatic relations with one government claiming to be China, and that this would be the PRC. Yet Canada would remain as neutral as possible in regard to China's claims to Taiwan. There's a danger with using the same words, however. Since both countries use the terms one China, it's easy to confuse the meaning of one China in Beijing and in Ottawa. Now, the world has changed incredibly since 1969 and 1970. First of all, the PRC has become the world's second largest economy and a military power that can, if current trends continue, enforce its claims beyond its current jurisdiction. Xi Jinping just this year has reiterated that he will use military means if necessary, thus raising the urgency of the issue everywhere. China has made regular incursions into Japanese waters on the other side of Taiwan, including Coast Guard patrols in the Senkaku Islands on 3 consecutive days in the past week. Just yesterday, there were Chinese military exercises around Taiwan as the AIT opened its new office in Taipei. So China is clearly the aggressor here. Secondly, Taiwan has blossomed into a full democracy and has, for all practical purposes, abandoned its claims to the Asian mainland, although the Constitution is still what it is. So we can see that in the past, our challenge was to welcome the PRC into the international community with the hope that both sides would eventually democratize and peacefully reach an agreement. That has not happened. So now, in 2019, as China has become more aggressive and has not democratized, and Taiwan is a democracy, our challenge is how to deter Chinese military aggression. So how can we keep alive the idea of Paul Martin Sr. to welcome China into the international community while also recognizing the effective political independence of Taiwan as a reality? Even in the absence of official diplomatic relations, Taiwan has become Canada's 11th largest trading partner in the world and 5th in Asia. There are currently over 200,000 Taiwanese people in Canada and 60,000 Canadians in Taiwan. This makes it one of the largest Canadian expatriate communities in the world. The CTOT in Taipei is Canada's 5th largest passport issuing office outside North America. Over 100,000 visitors go in both directions. Our two countries have collaborative projects in science and technology, human rights, indigenous cooperation, educational and youth exchanges, like the student trip I'm taking to Taiwan for next month, as well as other forms of multilateral work. For those of us who are like our smartphones and computers, it's important to remember that the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company makes 55.9% of the world's semiconductors. This is the status quo we're called upon to protect. It is obviously in Canada's interest to protect this relationship and to deter war over Taiwan or even a forced annexation that would cause a large refugee crisis and threaten our economic interests, including all of those things I just mentioned. China, however, uses their one China rhetoric to try to keep other states out of the region. They do this on a basis of many myths that they promote, the idea that Taiwan has been Chinese for thousands of years, which it has not been. There have only been 400 years of any Chinese people being on the island. I think of all the myths that they promote, the most dangerous one is the idea that the status of Taiwan is a Chinese domestic issue and that foreigners should stay out. This has never been the case. In fact, the status of Taiwan is undetermined as it is because of an international treaty, the 1952 San Francisco Peace Treaty, that ended the Pacific War and stipulated the disposition of Japanese territories without specifying a recipient for Taiwan and without asking the people of Taiwan what they thought about the matter. At that time, Canada was a signatory. Looking at the document, I can see that Lester Pearson and R.W. Mayhew signed for Canada. So Canada, along with other signatory states, has a legitimate stake in the future of Taiwan. So what this means in conclusion is that our relations with Taiwan are relations between two sovereign states. So far, we have operated under the assumption that downgrading relations with Taiwan, kind of giving them the cold shoulder to say, would bring benefits in our relations with China. I think that the detention of two prominent Canadians in relation for the extradition of Huawei's Meng Wanzhou to the United States should be a wake-up call about the arbitrary nature of law in that country. All of our business people in China are at risk. I will not travel there again, even though I've had a human rights project in China. I'm afraid to go there. We should be aware that our relations with the authoritarian regime in China come with very serious risks, and these are risks that our officials, businessmen, academics, and journalists do not encounter in Taiwan. In this context, we must be aware of the dangers of a rising China and find a way to deter aggression across the Taiwan Straits. If we go back to our original intention to neither challenge nor endorse China's claim to Taiwan, it behooves us to realize that a failure to challenge China on this has only led to an increase in military aggression and has not made them any kinder to Taiwan or to us than they would otherwise be. So if military aggression continues to escalate or other pressures from China on Taiwan, we should remind them that we do not endorse their spurious claim to Taiwan. So I think that this morning we'll have plenty of time to discuss what to do next. The American-Taiwan Relations Act is a good model for us, and we can discuss whether or not Canada needs similar legislation. So I'm very happy now that I have the pleasure and the honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Jean-Michel Cole, Jean-Michel, who is got an MA from War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada. He's a Taipei-based senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, senior fellow with the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Nottingham, senior fellow with Global Taiwan Institute in DC, associate researcher with the French Center for Research on Contemporary China, and chief editor of Taiwan Sentinel. So thank you very much. Merci.
Good morning, Dajahao. I'm very self-conscious now because I just spoke with my good friend Simon Song from TECO Ottawa. We hadn't seen each other in about a year, and the first thing that he told me, he says, "Oh, Michael, you've gained weight." And my response to him is that whenever my Taiwanese wife is stressed at work, she tends to bake cupcakes. So stress stemming from politics in Taiwan is to blame for the few pounds that he obviously has noticed. Well, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, friends, Ambassador Chen, good morning, Dajahao. It's a great honor to be here today, and I thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and Scott Simon as well for having me today for this important event, which coincides with the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. For me, this feels a bit like a homecoming as well, because when I worked for government in Ottawa between 2003 and 2005, I happened to live right next door on Goulburn Avenue. So this neighborhood feels quite familiar. 2005 being the year that I moved to Taiwan as well. So I've been there for 13 years and a half or so. In recent weeks, I've had to turn down a number of invitations to attend events in Taipei, marking the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, including a visit to the new AIT compound in Nehu, which finally, after many years of delays, is finally opening for business. The last issue that they had to deal with was fire safety issues, and State Department would not allow them to enter the building until they had resolved those issues. Upon learning that I would not be able to participate in those events in Taipei, and my informing them that the reason for my not being there was that I was going to Ottawa for a Taiwan Relations Act 40th event, I got a lot of quizzical reactions and whatnot. They're like, okay, so this is a TRA event, and you're not in DC, you're not in Taipei, you're in Ottawa, which is maybe that was quizzical, like, I don't know. Well, all of this is fair criticism. After all, the TRA is an act of Congress passed after the U.S. switched relations from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. And it is an instrument that institutionalizes the relations between United States and Taiwan. But that being said, I believe that, notwithstanding the absence of a TRA or an equivalent in Canada, there is a need for an engagement with Taiwan that transcends the legalization or the existence of a specific document to this end. And it became more logical, I would say, to have these kinds of instruments after Taiwan took off as an economic powerhouse, and even more importantly, after it became a vibrant democracy in an increasingly important part of the world. In the second decade of the 21st century, meanwhile, as China rose to assume a preeminent role in international affairs and began to impose its will on others, with its money, influence, military, and what is now known as sharp power, the need to deepen our engagement with democratic Taiwan becomes all the more pressing and, I would add, logical. As we collectively seek to find ways to cope with a powerful economy run by a ruthless authoritarian regime, and as we endeavor to balance our economic requirements with the need to defend the integrity of our democratic institutions and the values that underpin them, there is no more ideal a partner than Taiwan, a democracy of 23.5 million souls, which for decades has had to conjugate and balance these very requirements with its large authoritarian neighbor. Only in this case, the threat for Taiwan, unlike the threat for Canada, for example, is existential and an immediate one, as the PRC has long endeavored to annex Taiwan and incorporate it under the one country, two systems framework, which anyone who has followed developments in Hong Kong in recent years would know that is an absolutely non-viable proposition for the Taiwanese people. And we've seen the impact that this has had on the residents of Hong Kong's freedom, liberties, and democratic aspirations. In the past 5 years or so, the US government has begun to reassess its entire China strategy, which hitherto had operated under the assumption that patience and generosity, added to a strong dose of wishful thinking, would eventually help transform authoritarian China into something closer to a recognizable liberal democracy. Instead, short-sightedness and self-interest yielded a resilient authoritarianism under Hu Jintao, followed by dictatorship under Xi Jinping that now threatens the international system that has existed since the conclusion of World War II. This reassessment, which it's important to mention predates and will survive Donald Trump, has in turn emboldened US officials to push the envelope on what is permissible under the ambit of the TRA and the US's One China policy. We must remember that in most cases, the limits to our engagement with Taiwan are self-imposed, a result of us allowing Beijing to define the nature of our laws. In the past 2 or 3 years, Washington has launched a series of bilateral activities with Taiwan, many of them under the Global Cooperation Training Framework, or GCTF, and then soon under the US Department of State's Global Engagement Center, or GEC, addressing a variety of topics from disease prevention to media literacy, a polite term for fake news, law enforcement, and religious freedom, which was held just last month. Finding in Taiwan a willing partner, the US has also sought a greater role for the island nation in defending freedom, encouraging good governance, and improving development aid in the Pacific Islands, 6 of which are official diplomatic allies of Taiwan and the target of strong pressure from the PRC. Meanwhile, the US defense relationship with Taiwan has remained robust, with continued arms sales, joint training, US Navy transits in the Taiwan Strait, and various ongoing programs. There is no doubt in my mind that the US military understands the value of keeping Taiwan as an ally in the region, and that its loss would prove destabilizing for the entire Indo-Pacific. This deepening of ties between Taiwan and the US since 2016, and I think it's fair to say that those are at an all-time high, has also been deeply troubling to the Chinese leadership. And every time they meet with officials and academics, this is the very first question that comes out of their mouths is, what's going on between the United States and Taiwan? Why are they getting so close? Beijing is quite worried at what we've seen recently. Besides the changing international context and shifting perceptions of China, Responsible, pragmatic, and predictable leadership in Taipei and a commitment to diversifying Taiwan's engagement with partners around the world has been one of the key accomplishments of the Taiwan administration. Unlike her predecessors' often exclusive focus on China, or his predecessors' often reckless attitude, which alienated and scared many potential international partners, President Tsai Ing-wen has wisely ascertained global attitudes and actively sought engagement where engagement was possible, while at the same time respecting the limits of their foreign counterparts. In many cases, this has meant quiet, semi-official work behind closed doors, prioritizing constructiveness over publicity. In my nearly 14 years in Taiwan, I don't think there's ever been a period when Taiwan received so many delegations of members of Congress, members of parliament, government officials, academics, and journalists. And all of this has occurred for a reason. Still, there have been failures as well, such as efforts by the US and a coalition of democracies, including Canada, to ensure that Taiwan has meaningful participation at multilateral agencies such as the World Health Organization, Interpol, and the Montreal-based International Civil Aviation Organization. And I can tell you that in my interactions with them, ICAO has oftentimes not been civil when I mention Taiwan. In those cases, the international community has allowed Beijing to dictate the terms, often through its growing influence at the UN General Assembly. We, the world's democracies, must do more on that front, for disease, crime, terrorism, and air safety recognize no borders. And we cannot afford to have a blind spot in our system or to turn down a partner that not only is willing to do its part, but that has many contributions to offer. Taiwan is Canada's 12th largest economic partner, or 11th, according to Scott. And the complementary of the two economies means that a lot more can be accomplished in terms of bilateral trade, investment, and collaboration. Year after year, the small team of trade experts at the Canadian Trade Office in Taiwan, Canada's unofficial embassy, has outperformed many embassies worldwide with several times the number of staff. This accomplishment, which has been the envy of many Canadian embassy in other countries, is testament to the hard work of dedicated Canadian officials, several of whom I have come to know and befriended over the years, one of whom is former representative to Taiwan, Mario Sainte-Marie. We have two of them as well, that's right, so welcome. And it's also the result of the appeal of Taiwan's modern economy and what it has to offer to the Canadian economy. There are still some obstacles, and legal reform often is frustratingly slow in Taiwan, but progress has been made, and I am sure that we will see more over the coming years. Exchanges between our two societies are also vibrant. Every year, thousands of Taiwanese come to Canada to study, and according to Canadian government figures, there are nearly 200,000 people of Taiwanese descent in Canada, and nearly 60,000 Canadian nationals living in Taiwan, and I am certainly one of them. Canada has a very positive image among the Taiwanese. It's seen as a country with a strong commitment to democracy and rule of law. And like Taiwan, it is a middle power that needs to make space for itself despite its proximity to a powerful neighbor. Now that Canada is at long last awakening to the potential pitfalls of forming a close relationship with a revisionist and undemocratic China, as the Huawei controversy and Beijing's retaliation have made perfectly clear, Canadians of all stripe in government, in academia, in the media, and in civil society have a renewed interest in reaching out to their Taiwanese counterparts. This isn't only because Taiwan's long experience of dealing with China, though no doubt this generates much of its appeal. Taiwan doesn't have all the solutions, and it too is struggling to identify, to track, and to find appropriate ways to counter Chinese growing influence, interference, and sharp power. More than ever, this challenge that threatens all our democracies calls for cooperation among like-minded countries so that we together can come up with a countervailing strategy. For this, we need countries like Taiwan. And Taiwan needs us too. We're in this together, and the more united we are, the more difficult it will be for China's united front to undermine our institutions and the very fabric of our societies. As I mentioned earlier, the US has taken the lead in adding Taiwan to its multilateral efforts in the Indo-Pacific. The GCTF model, for example, has proven appealing to other countries in the region, with Japan and Australia reaching out and now joining those endeavors. Canada, too, has every advantage in joining this fledgling alliance. Either it can join GCTF projects, or it can emulate that format and create its own Track 1.5 or Track 2 initiatives with Taiwan. Among other things, I can think of cyber, counterintelligence, combating organized crime and human trafficking, good governance, media literacy, rule of law, humanitarian assistance as possible areas of cooperation between the two sides. I would also encourage the Department of National Defense and the Royal Military College of Canada to explore the possibility of sending some of their cadets and students to Taiwan for language training. Taiwan provides a friendly and much safer environment in which to learn a new language than China does today, where cadets are bound to be spied upon and perhaps even become the targets of attempted recruitment by Chinese intelligence apparatus. In academia, there is much room for growth and exchanges between the two sides. On this front, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has done excellent work in recent years and serves as an example of what can be accomplished with Taiwan. Among other things, it recently signed a MOU with the Prospect Foundation in Taipei, a government-sponsored think tank that conducts research in the security area. Its collaboration with the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy has also yielded some interesting results in recent months. Others can follow suit, but none of this would be possible without leadership within our governments and the will to stand our ground whenever Beijing expresses its displeasure. As more and more countries begin to emulate the US model for interacting with Taiwan, I'm confident that China will lose some of its ability to constrain Taiwan. No doubt Beijing will complain and threaten, but all of this is survivable. And why would it stop doing that since it's gotten its way so many times by threatening governments when they sought engagement with Taiwan? But last time I checked, Canada was still a sovereign country with its own one China policy, which is not to be confused with Beijing's one China principle. Canada can say no to China and it can say yes to Taiwan when doing so is in its national interest. And defending a democracy is, in my opinion, in Canada's national interest. Let me now turn briefly to some of the challenges that Taiwan is facing today and why I insist that Taiwan's fate is of concern to all of us. For all its imperfections and contradictions, Taiwan is an extraordinary place, an experiment in democracy and modernity in the larger Chinese world without equivalent. Anyone who has visited it cannot but be impressed with the place and its people. Its freedoms and democracy, while also imperfect, are an example to a region where such liberties are an increasingly rare commodity. On many issues, from freedom of speech to gender equality to LGBTQI rights to a vibrant and multifaceted civil society, Taiwan is light years ahead of any country in the region. Its extinction, therefore, would be a great loss to the region and to the world. It would be a psychological blow to those who still hold onto the belief that China model isn't the solution to the challenges that we face in the 21st century. Taiwan's disappearance as a free sovereign state would open a new front in the authoritarian assault that is being waged against democracies worldwide. Taiwan isn't a domestic issue for China, nor is it simply, as some have argued, unfinished business in the Chinese Civil War. Rather, Taiwan is a key piece of the puzzle in an increasingly important part of the world, and it is an intrinsic part of the international community, no matter how much it has been ignored by global institutions. As such, whatever happens to Taiwan will inevitably have repercussions outside the immediate region. For one thing, if authoritarian China gets its way and annexes Taiwan, this will reward and embolden a regime that won't stop there. In other words, Taiwan's fate will determine the kind of China that the rest of the world will have to deal with for decades to come. Sadly, Taiwan faces this existential threat amid widening divisions and polarization in its society. Populism, disinformation, computational propaganda, united front work, and elite capture are at an all-time high and serve to weaken the ability of the Taiwanese to respond to the China threat accordingly. Moderation is being replaced by irrationality at both ends of the political spectrum, and the political center, which politicians like President Tsai have occupied, risks being eroded. It is that center that has given Taiwan the resilience that it needs to defend itself against the external threat posed by China. When extremes take over the discourse, the center does not hold, and to quote a famous poet, things fall apart. What sharp power does is to amplify already existing trends and contradictions in society by directing them in a way that tear a targeted society apart. We're also seeing worrying signs of a growing threat of intimidation and physical violence by pro-Beijing organizations that are currently operating in Taiwan. Meanwhile, China continues to establish links with a civil society in Taiwan, bypassing central government institutions and working with politicians, elected or not, who are willing to play along. Beijing has realized over the years that traditional parties in Taiwan, whether KMT or DPP, have internalized the expectations of democracy to such an extent that neither will be in a position to deliver what Beijing wants, and that is what it calls peaceful unification, translation, annexation. This realization has compelled Beijing, therefore, to reach out to political outsiders, either independent candidates, candidates from small parties, or members of established parties who are nevertheless outliers. A few examples throughout history of politicians who hijacked the party system and democracy come to mind. People like Alberto Fujimori, Rodrigo Duterte, and Donald Trump. All have exerted, shall we say, a negative influence on democratic institutions of their countries. I sense that Beijing is now aiming to accomplish a similar feat in Taiwan, and thereby to break the democratic firewall that has long frustrated its efforts to take over the island nation. I need not name names. The politicians are out there, and a few of them have already been elected. We have yet to know who will be the candidates in Taiwan's January 2020 general elections, but I can think of one nightmare scenario which would be disastrous to Taiwan's democracy, and I hope this does not come to pass. Amid all this, Beijing continues to insist on Taiwan recognizing the so-called 1992 consensus in One China, which Xi Jinping has made perfectly clear no longer countenances the possibility of different interpretations. Long ago, Xi Jinping telegraphed his impatience and has made it clear that, in his view, the Taiwan question cannot be left unresolved indefinitely. Hence, his insistence on a more proactive effort on the part of the Taiwanese compatriots to achieve peaceful reunification, as his January 2nd address reminded us. And of course, accompanying this political warfare and economic incentives is the threat of military force. While the military is still Xi's option of last resort, it is a real threat nonetheless. As China intensifies its sorties around Taiwan and crosses the center line in the Taiwan Strait, the risks of accidents and miscommunication have increased markedly, and with that, the real possibility of disastrous escalation. That is why, more than ever, the world's leading democracies, including Canada, must rally to the cause of freedom and international law, at the center of which lies the very existence of Taiwan. Abandonment will only feed the wolves in Beijing, whereas closer collective ties with Taiwan will bolster its resilience, give its people the certainty that their defiance of oppression is worthwhile, and force Beijing to think twice about adopting harsh measures against the democratic island nation. No government acts altruistically. Governments, first and foremost, serve the national interest. Taiwan, therefore, cannot expect that other countries will go out of their way to defend it unless its defense serves their own national interest. This may sound cold and callous, but this is international politics for you. My view and much of my work over the years has reflected this position, is that Taiwan is an indispensable and inseparable part of the international community. But Taiwan can and should do more to explain this to the rest of the world. And when it does, it is my fondest hope that other countries will meet it halfway. Thank you.